20001 or call us at area code 202-626-4898. Now a conversation with sociologist Daniel Bell on his book, The Coming of Post-Industrial Society, originally published in 1973 and still in print in both hardcover and paperback. In the book, Mr. Bell describes the structural changes beginning to take place in the marketplace and how these changes were affecting society, culture, and the political system. He explores the shift from an economy based on industry and manufacturing to one based on information and knowledge. The interview lasts about an hour.
Daniel Bell, the author of The Coming of Post-Industrial Society, a venture in social forecasting. Your book was first published in 1973. It came out again in an anniversary edition in 1999. What do you mean by a post-industrial society?
Well, basically, it's in contrast to the idea of an industrial society. We've lived through for 200 years an industrial society, which fundamentally was the application of energy to machines. Before that, we never had that kind of form of, well, let me say, productivity. If there is anything which is unique to the modern world, it's the idea of productivity. The idea that we can make more with less, and with the same inputs get a greater output. For example, if one goes back to someone like Leonardo da Vinci, the great geniuses we know, if you look at his notebooks, he'd imagined a submarine, an airplane, a threshing machine, refrigeration. He'd imagined all these things, except he couldn't imagine a source of energy sufficient to drive them. So when, as the story goes, when Mr. Watt saw on his mother's stove, the teapot rising because steam was pushing up the top, he thought, well, if we can have a chamber which encloses this, we can have a force of energy. And out of that we get the steam locomotive, steamship, factories, etc. And therefore you have a radical change in the very nature of modern technology, beginning with the application of energy to the application of machines. My interest has always been in technology and the changes in technology. And I thought, well, what comes after a machine technology? Now, to a large extent, the idea comes of an intellectual technology. And the post-industrial society has several different dimensions. It's on the most obvious level a change from a goods-producing society to services. But services is not, as many people think, fast food. If anything, it's the radical opposite of it. It's fundamentally human services, which is health, education, professional services, business services, entertainment, all of these which require higher education. And the biggest expansion of society is in services. Today in the United States, about 70% of the GNP is engaged in services. And therefore, this is a radical shift in the nature of the society. And that by now is fairly obvious. It was even beginning to be obvious when I first thought about these things, about going back 35 or more years ago. But the more important thing, which is still not completely realized, is a radical shift in the source of innovation. And here I would say, and this is the second dimension of my argument, that a post-industrial society is the codification of theoretical knowledge. All societies have always existed on the basis of knowledge and the transmission of knowledge. What makes us different from animals and other species is our ability to transmit knowledge. It goes back to the time, I suppose, when there was a change in the cortex and the larynx, and allows people to take sounds and codify them, so that if you and I speak, we hope other people will understand them if they know the language. So there's a symbolic codification. So there's always been a codification of knowledge, but not of theoretical knowledge. Now what I mean by that is this. If you look at all the major industries we still roughly have, steel, telephone, automobile, electricity, even aviation, they were all 19th century industries. They were all done by what I would call talented tinkerers, by men who worked quite independently of what was going on in science. Darby, who invented the coking process for making steel, Bessemer, who invented the open hearth process for the radical transformation of steel, Thomas Alva Edison, the great genius who invented the filaments for the electric light bulb, or the gramophone, or the motion picture, knew nothing of the work of Maxwell and Faraday on electromagnetism. Marconi, who did the wireless, knew nothing of the work of Hertz on radio waves. And they all worked essentially as men who were tinkering around and creating things. The radical change comes in the 20th century with quantum physics. It It comes from the fact that people begin seeing that the classical physics, which is highly deterministic, has beneath it a whole series of other dimensions. Much of this goes back in 1904, 1905, some famous papers of Einstein, which he published in the Annales de Physique. One of the papers, for example, is special relativity, which is the equation of matter and energy, with the famous equation of E equal mc squared. Another paper on the Brownian motion. But his major paper, in this respect, his major paper, was the idea that light is not just a wave, but a quantum, a pulse. And out of that paper of Einstein, you get a whole radical transformation of innovation. You get out of that notion a photoelectric cell. And a photoelectric cell means that an elevator opens and closes when the cell is broken. In a camera, you will have a photoelectric cell, which will, in a sense, organize the light for the focusing of the camera. A laser is simply an acronym. Light amplified by the stimulation of the emission of radiation, which was invented by Charles Towns at Columbia in '39. Other people claim it, but Towns basically is the name associated with it. All these go back to the paper of Einstein in 1905 on optics. So here you have a radical transformation, the same thing with the transistor, which goes back to the notions of solid-state physics and the shifts of electrons in their orbits. So that here you get a radical change in the sources of innovation in society. And I called it at that time a post-industrial society because it was in relationship to the industrial society. Today, more people call it the information age, or knowledge society, or some other dimension of this sort. But for me, it still remains on that form of a pre-industrial, an industrial, and a post-industrial society.
Were you the first to bring all these thoughts together? Because the reaction of this book was quite significant for some reason. And can you talk about what those reasons might be that it seemed to garner so much attention back in 1973?
Well, I used the phrase post-industrial society, and then one will find out, as any author does, that eventually somebody earlier used it, but no one had really used it and developed it in the way that I did. It came for several reasons. First of all, it was popularized by Herman Kahn, his name I've largely almost forgotten, but who was very successful in his work on thermonuclear war. But he also became a futurist, and he used the idea of post-industrial society. And then Alvin Toffler and John Nesbitt sort of took some of the ideas and also popularized it in this way. Toffler wrote a book which perhaps unkindly I call Future Schlock, but and Nesbitt has mega trends, which even might be called sugar trends, but I'm not being wholly unfair to these men. Maybe it's a matter of envy of the royalties they get as against the academic royalties. I'm being invidious here for the moment. But no, it was popularized, but also it clearly struck a nerve in the sense of people being suddenly aware of this kind of shift, mostly on the level of services.
When this came out, what was the greatest misinterpretation of your work, do you think?
Largely, people didn't wholly understand what was going on, what I was saying here. They're saying, why are you talking about different stages of society? Isn't everything going on seemingly seamlessly? I'm saying, no, there are somewhat radical changes taking place, and we become aware of them in that way. In other places, for example, in the Soviet Union, this is regarded as being an anti-Marxist book, which is not at all the case. In fact, when I was interviewed, I would always say I'm a post-Marxist.
Well, what did the Soviets think it was anti-Marxist about it?
Well, they claimed, you see, there were two things. They claimed that there was something called the scientific and technological revolution, and they were the ones in the forefront of it, when actually they were holding it back in some ways. More importantly, one of the aspects of the book was to point out that the industrial working class was shrinking. In fact, today, if you look at the labor force statistics, the industrial working class is about 15% of the labor force. The professional and technical managerial group is 30%, twice as many. But if the working class is shrinking, how can you have a dictatorship of the proletariat? So this was regarded as a kind of ideological thrust. And this was during the time of the Cold War, post-Cold War situation, and therefore this was taken as one more illustration of attacks on their own legitimacy in terms of their doctrine. People would attack the legitimacy in terms of their politics and morals, but this runs to an attack on their doctrine. I'd also written a book called The End of Ideology. So they saw that as a kind of successive attacks on them based upon these different themes. So they saw this as an attack on their ideology. And to that extent, those who were of a left-wing bent also went along with that line.
When did End of Ideology come out?
The End of Ideology came out originally in 1960. Different essays have been published long before that, but as a book it came out in 1960.
And the main message was?
The main message was that the old humanistic ideologies of the 19th, 20th century were becoming exhausted, and that, in effect, they'd be succeeded by various parochial ideologies, tribalism, ethnicity, etc. But essentially, it was a statement which was saying that Marxism, as an ideological fact, was biologically exhausted. Not as an intellectual fact, because there's huge numbers of things that one finds and still defines be read in Marx. The main idea, however, the end of ideology is somewhat different, and again, it's somewhat needs a kind of historical background to see what I was trying to argue. What I was saying is that basically, if one looked at the last 300 years, there's a crossover in the nature of politics, a crossover from religion to ideology. If one goes back, for example, and looks at the English Civil War of the 17th century with Cromwell's model army, with the so-called Fifth Monarchy men, these were wars fought in religious terms, although they had a political substructure. But the language and the rhetoric were political. Hobbes' Leviathan is an attack on those who claimed, you will bring the kingdom of God on earth. And that's why he says, can you pull out the hook from Leviathan? Which is why the term has its meaning in Hobbes. But the English Civil War was basically a war in religious terms for the kingdom of God on earth, but with political undertones. With the French Revolution, you got a radical shift. The French Revolution became an ideological doctrines with religious undertones. The various forms of the celebrations, the carnivals, etc., were religious, but the language and rhetoric were ideological. So there's a great historical crossover from religion to ideology. What I'm saying is we've now reached the end of those ideological elements.
Well, let's get back to the book we're talking about, which is what you also called a venture in social forecasting. What did you mean by social forecasting, and what difference is there between it and making predictions?
Well, predictions usually are point events. Who will become president of the United States in the year 2000? That's a rather risky prediction. We used to say, what will happen after the death of Tito? Is a risky prediction. What will happen in Iraq after the going of Saddam? That's a risky prediction. I don't think one can make predictions. Many years before, I'd initiated a group called the Commission on the Year 2000 of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 1965. And one of our members was Zbigniew Brzezinski, with him, and I was teaching at Columbia. This is before Brzezinski became the National Security Advisor for Mr. Carter. And someone said to him on television once, Mr. Brzezinski, you are a criminologist? He said, well, if you like that ugly word. He said, you tell the State Department what goes on in the Soviet Union? He says, well, when they listen. And the man sprung his trap and said, Professor Brzezinski, how come you failed to predict the oust of Khrushchev? And Spig was rather quick in his feet and said, tell me, if Khrushchev couldn't predict his own oust, how do you expect me to do it? Well, that's what I mean, that prediction is inherently unstable.
So we shouldn't read this book for a list of what was going to happen as of 1973?
No, couldn't. What I tried to do is to identify structural changes in society, changes which in fact radically affect the lives of individuals. A change from an agrarian society to an industrial society is a radical change. At the beginning of the century, something like 35% of the people in this country were engaged in agriculture. 50% of the people lived on farms. Today, less than 4% of the people work on farms. That's a structural change. Once you can identify structural changes, you can then try to deal with the outcomes of them in this way. So it's an effort to, which as a sociologist I try to do, to look at structural changes in society and look at their long-term consequences. Let me give you a different kind of illustration. If we were talking here before World War II, talk about social problems, we would talk about sharecropping. The word probably doesn't mean much to most people today, but sharecropping meant that most blacks before the World War II lived on the farms in the South. They didn't own the farm, and they took a share of the crop as part of the work for their work. Well, sharecropping is almost entirely eliminated. Why? If you look for trend line extrapolation, which is a bad way of dealing with forecasting, agricultural productivity from 1900 to 1940 had been going up between 1% to 2% a year. If you extrapolated, it would go on this way. During the war, it suddenly shot up radically. Why? Because the introduction of chemical fertilizer. And the chemical fertilizers suddenly meant that agricultural productivity went to 8% a year. When you went that way, people were simply shifted off the farms. They were unnecessary. So the blacks who shifted off the farms went north. They went to Watts in Los Angeles, they went to Bronzeville in Chicago, they went up to Philadelphia, Boston, and you got a radical reorganization of the society in that respect. So you can trace out social consequences by looking at these structural changes.
What did you not anticipate as of 1973?
Good question. Embarrassing question.
Well, not if you're not in the business of prediction.
Well, it wasn't much even prediction. It wasn't really looking at the... let me go back further. In '73, I had rectified my error. In the commission of the year 2000 and the report we did in 1966, we missed one basic change. And as I say, I'm a little chagrined about it. But it's an interesting reason. Also, of course, you try to learn why you... We missed the emergence of women. Extraordinary change. Why? Well, to some extent, you see, if one thinks about an industrial society is male work. In 1950 even, 75% of the labor force was a man at work with a wife and 2 children at home. A social change of this kind is an intersection of 2 things. It's an intersection of the changes in ideological and moral terms and the ability to institutionalize it in market terms. Now, the emergence of women goes back, as we know, to Susan B. Anthony, to Elizabeth Cady Stanton, to the various other elements, suffragette movements, etc. And those were the ideological moral components. But women were still not mostly at work, except ethnic women, mostly in factories of various kinds. But by and large, it was not that kind of situation. So we missed, in a sense, the women until we began thinking about the post-industrial society book. There I do have a section on women. For the first time in post-industrial society, you have a basis for women to go to work, particularly in the professions and the services. Health, education, social services, professional services, research are all where women can come to work. So here you have for the first time the institutionalization of work in market terms for women and the opportunities for women, which you didn't have largely before 1950. You had Rosie the Rivet as a kind of symbolic image in World War II, but that was temporary, and that was an industry. The expansion of post-industrial sectors meant for the first time that large numbers of women can go back to work. So I missed that, or we missed that, in the commission of the year 2000, and partly because we only had one woman on the commission, that was Margaret Mead, who's as good as any 10 men when she would thump her stick this way. But we didn't, and even Margaret Mead didn't catch us up on that. But when I came to write the Post-Industrial Society book, I suddenly thought, wait a minute now. Let me really think through the consequences of this. So I do have a section on women there. So I would say earlier, I missed that very important role of women.
Did you anticipate the intranet?
Yes. Not the internet per se. And to some extent, I think Al Gore has gotten a bad rap because when he said he invented the internet, people mocked him. He didn't invent the internet, but what Al Gore did was to introduce the legislation which changed the DARPA, which is the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, to the National Science Foundation. The transfer from the internet from the military to the scientific community was made by a bill of Al Gore. No, because one of the things which is crucial is that nothing ever comes out of the blue. There's too much of a gee whiz about technology. There's a long build-up to a lot of these things. The internet was available for a long time in terms of the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency. They set up the internet for communications among the military forces. Then the National Science Foundation took it over and made it a basis for communication among all the universities. And finally, it came from the more popular internet for business. So it's not something we anticipated per se, but yes, we know we saw it's coming. What you sometimes can't deal with, and that's the more interesting thing for commercial and other purposes, is the rate of change. The rapidity of it is quite surprising. And that's always a function of the price and demand and such. For example, if you take something like a fax machine, fax machines were available a long time ago, more than 25, 30 years ago, but the ability to cut down the price and speed suddenly makes it more available in this way. In the same way, for example, years ago, because of the cost of transportation, newspapers thought they could send newspapers through the television sets. In Japan, the Asahi Shimbun, the largest paper, would try to get copies to Hokkaido, and we have to go through a long, they didn't have the tunnel then, or the bridges, so they tried to do it through the television sets. And you can still find one at Columbia Journalism School And in Japan, newspapers been coming out of television sets far away, you see. And that's sort of a prototype of some internet type of things. So all these things are always in the works, so to speak. And you can try to identify them, yes. But the rate of change is a function of demand, price, availability, speed, and usefulness to people.
We talk about a lot of both literary works and sociological works such as this that change society some way. What is it that a book like this does that causes change, or is even that the right question?
No, it's the right question. Whether it applies to this book is
But do you think it applies to this book?
To some extent, I think more and more now, yes. It came out, probably less so. I think two things happen in terms of books. The more important one is that it suddenly concretizes an idea. It simply pulls together a whole series of things and suddenly it snaps out. You've been doing, I gather, a large section on Tocqueville. Now, if you look at the very beginning, as you probably know, of Democracy in America, he says, a new idea has been loosed in the world. It's an idea or a new principle which cannot be reversed and will only be expanded. That principle is equality. Now, he'd taken an idea which is largely unknown politically and suddenly saw it as what I would call a master key in this way. Marx, at the very beginning of Capital, talks about commodity production, the fetishism of commodities. Work and the production of goods is no longer for use or for simply on order, but as a commodity to be spread to a market. Max Weber, the great sociologist, talked about rationalization. So they've taken a key idea and suddenly brought it together in this way. We're still working out the implications of the idea of equality 150 years after Tocqueville. To give you an illustration of the differences of that kind, 80 years ago, there's a man named Lord Bryce, wrote a book called The American Commonwealth. And there's the most comprehensive book about American politics, American society. And nobody read Tocqueville any longer, they read Bryce. Now nobody reads Bryce, but Tocqueville is still relevant. Because Bryce had gone into all great details, but the details change. An underlying principle remains. So that in Tocqueville or in Marx or in Weber, you have the ability to capture a fundamental idea of this kind. And to the extent that I've tried to identify several ideas here in the change of technology, from a machine technology to an intellectual technology, or the use of algorithms in intellectual technology, the codification of theoretical knowledge, which I still think is the unappreciated source of what I have there in the book. People more and more now come to understand that it's the codification of theoretical knowledge of science, originally in physics, now in the next century in biology, which is going to be directive of change.
How does a book like this, and let's say this particular book, move into the world so that it changes the way people do things or think about things? Can you get it on a micro level like that?
Yes, insofar as you have always people trying to understand and translate these things in policy terms. If they're purely an academic exercise, probably not the case. But to the extent that you now have to confront the situations that come from it, you have it. Take, for example, the key basic idea, by now so commonplace to be banal, the role of higher education. That you cannot get ahead in a modern society without going ahead into higher education. The time this book was published, the number of people who are going to college was relatively minor. 10, 15% going through college today, it's probably 35%.
In the United States?
In the United States. But this is worldwide. The rates will vary. But the shift from property to education in terms of social mobility becomes a crucial element. If education then is a crucial element, how do you get a good education? What is a good curriculum? How do you deal with people who fall back? How do you teach them? I mean, all these things suddenly come to the fore. They've always been there as problems, but not on the scale. And that's the second element which is crucial. Most changes are not changes in principle, but changes of scale. Many people talk about the rate of change, and that's a crucial point in some way. The difficulty, however, is that it's difficult to measure. A rate is a pace. And then you say change of what? So it's a metaphor rather than a measurement. But a change of scale is something which is much different. Change of scale is something which you can actually measure. It goes back to Galileo, We had what we call the square cube law. If you double something in size, you triple its value. And therefore, you can see the dimensions of when you change the size of a corporation, when you change the size of government, all these elements of the control systems come into play. There's a man named Darcy Wentworth Thompson, a great British biologist, who wrote a book called On Growth and Form back in the beginning of the 20th century. He's dealing with the nature of trees and how high trees can grow to maintain the kind of bulk. And being a man of ingenious form, he thought, you know, there's a marvelous story called Jack and the Beanstalk, in which Jack is told by his mother not to climb the beanstalk because there's a giant up there 10 times the size of Jack who will eat him up or something. But Jack, being a rather curious and inquisitive and rambunctious boy, climbs the beanstalk, as we know. And the giant is there, and the giant comes chasing after Jack, and Jack runs down the beanstalk and takes an axe, and the giant comes tumbling down and is killed. And Darcy Thompson says, it's curious. If the giant were 10 times the size of man, it would be 10 to the third power. It'd look like a Michelin tire. He would look like a man. And if Jack knew the laws of physics, he had nothing to fear.
So how does the differences in scale translate into our understanding of, say, the global economy?
When you have a change of scale, you change the size of the arena. You have more people coming into it, and the rapidity of change in the interactions becomes greater. So you're multiplying the number of actors, and you're increasing the number of interactions. And once you multiply the number of actors, increase the interactions, you have a whole new ballgame. It's like going from the United Nations, which at the beginning perhaps had 30 nations, now to over 200. Many more actors, many more interactions. The same way, of course, with financial controls, commodity flows, and various other things of this kind. So the change of scale allows you to measure a number of these situations.
I have a quotation from you where you say, in terms of this issue of scale, that the national state is becoming too small for the big problems of life and too big for the small problems. Could you expand on that?
Yes, this is part of a paper I wrote in 1977 when I was the U.S. representative at OECD in Paris on a project called Interfutures. The national state is really an adaptive mechanism. It's not there out of any God-given reason. Germany became a national state only about the 1870s, and Bismarck, before 1860s, 1870s, when Bismarck united the various states of Prussia and Bavaria and hundreds of the various small states. Italy became a national state in the 1850s. France earlier. The United Kingdom came together only in the 1920s even. But you have a situation where there's an adaptive mechanism because of the change of economic activities. And therefore you needed a larger mechanism to control and regulate economic activities. You had introduction of railroads, various kinds. You have therefore a whole new situation of that sort. Therefore the national state is an adaptive mechanism to deal with that. Now, what's happening now is that if you look at what's going on with the deal of capital flows, commodity flows, currency flows, population demographic flows, the national state become ineffective in terms of the larger scale which has taken place. So it's become too small for the big problems of life. But then you have the multiplication now of activities on the town level, local level, city level. So it's become too big for the small problems of life. And therefore we now talk about going back to the States, devolution in England, returning things to the States here. And yet for the big things of life, we still know international mechanisms to match these things. One of the things which I've pointed out, for example, is if you look at the New Deal of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, people think of the New Deal in ideological terms as either shoring up capitalism, introducing statism, or if you're radical, they're saving capitalism. Well, the New Deal, yes, did introduce statism or saving capitalism, but that was not for me the significance of the New Deal. The New Deal for me was doing something else. From 1900 to 1930, you began to develop a national economy, but you had no national society. You had no national state. What you had was government before regulating things among states. What the New Deal did for the first time was introduce national political institutions. You had an agricultural aid administration for farm problems. You had an SEC to regulate the financial markets. You had an NLRB for labor bargaining. So what Roosevelt did was to create a national state to match the national economy. And the matching of scales allowed for a certain degree of relationships to keep the society going. So yes, there were these ideological elements, but for me it was the change of scale which was crucial to understanding of what the New Deal and Roosevelt was all about. On the same basis, even though we now have a national state and national society, it's become too big for the small problems, so we're getting a move back, but also ineffective for the larger ones. So what do we have now? Well, you have NAFTA to try to bring together Mexico, United States, and Canada. You have the European Union to bring together the various countries of Europe, and to some extent the Southeast Asian element of pulling them together that way too. So it may be that we'll now have regional blocks. Then the question is the currencies. What do you then? Well, you now have a euro, a yen, and a dollar, and you'll have then a tripod in that respect as well. So we're getting radical changes of scale as we're now going through these last 10 years of the last century and going on to the next.
I want to talk about the kind of person who comes up with these kinds of things, these thoughts, these broad thoughts. In looking at some of your books in the review, particularly of the Coming of Post-Industrial Society, the most recent edition, which was just last year, I saw a lot of references to you as a polymath. What is a polymath, and how does one become one? And does one want to become a polymath?
I don't think of myself as a polymath.
What is a polymath?
I don't know. Presumably a polymath is one who knows a lot of things in different fields and such. I don't think of myself as a polymath.
What are you?
Curious. I've written now, depending upon how one counts it, particularly the Japanese books written for Japan, 15, 16, 17 books. And they're all rather different in some way. And once somebody said to me, what do you teach? I said, I teach what I want to learn, I write what I've learned. I'm in a fortunate position, which very few people have been, but it's one of the great parts of being an academe, that a place like Harvard, University, you're allowed to teach what you want to do. And I have a chair which allows me to move around. So that being curious, I'm looking at something, so I teach what I want to learn, I write what I've learned. I was for many years on Fortune magazine, and I taught at the University of Chicago before I went to Fortune, and then I was on Fortune for quite a few years. And then Columbia University, where I've been teaching part-time, offered me to come back full-time, and I accepted, and I had lunch with Mr. Luce, then the proprietor of Time Inc.
Henry Luce.
Henry Luce, and he said, are you unhappy? I said, no, not really. I was fairly happy at Fortune. He said, but you're taking a 50% cut in salary? I said, yes. And you're going back to academic life? I said, yes. He said, why? I said, there are 4 good reasons, Mr. Luce. He said, 4 good reasons? What are they? I said, June, July, August, and September.
What did you decide to teach when you went into teaching?
Sociology. Fortunately, the years I began with sociology with various colleagues like Marty Lipset, who's here at George Mason, or Ralph Dahrendorf in London, you can look at the whole world. You can look at the changes of the world. So that being a sociologist, I used to say, oddly enough, sociology was the last refuge of individualism. You can teach whatever you want, call it the sociology of. The sociology of culture, the sociology of religion, the sociology of technology, etc. So that one had that openness. Today, it's rather shrunk. It's become mathematical, quantitative. I'm not minimizing it, but it's lost the interest in larger questions.
Well, on that point, I was reading the LA Times book review of your book by Michael Lind, and he says, in a university system captured by pedants and ideologues, it is unlikely that any prestigious university would hire a brilliant generalist like Bell or publish books as ambitious as his. In a media market increasingly subordinate to the entertainment industry, it is unlikely that major trade publishers could be found for the contemporary equivalents of Bell's major works, of which this is one. What do you think about that?
Well, in principle, I think he's right. I mean, substantially true, but what makes a very good university is the fact that they do go after people this way. Harvard, Columbia, and other places are open still. Within the professions, it's more difficult because you then have to go through the sort of the rituals of the regulated rules now, quantitative dimensions, mathematical dimensions, etc. But for example, I have a colleague at Harvard, a brilliant sociologist, Christopher Jenks. He's written on equality and such. And when it was called Sandy Jenks, so I'll be familiar. So otherwise, we say Christopher sounds all formal. But when Sandy was an assistant professor, he said to me, how do you get tenure at Harvard? I said, Sandy, you either play by the rules, which is a long time and you will never get, but if you write a book that's going to get a lot of attention, Harvard's going to feel very proud of you. And Stanley wrote a book on inequality, which was a great success. Harvard gave him tenure. John Kenneth Galbraith was probably the main example of this sort. Ken Galbraith is a man who writes beautifully, endlessly, but professionally he's regarded perhaps by the rather than pedants as not being a great professional economist. He's not in the narrow sense, but he thinks about ideas.
How do you describe yourself politically?
Well, over the years, having had a lot of debates with various people, I said once jokingly, but then very seriously, I'm a socialist in economics, a liberal in politics, and a conservative in culture.
How do you reconcile those?
Well, as I say, people sometimes talk about a one-dimensional man, want a one-dimensional definition. But I think, and this is part of the kind of sociology I do, that there are different realms in society, and they're not congruent. That the economy is different from the polity, and the polity is different from the culture. In economics, when something is cheaper, better, more efficient, it's used, subject to cost. So it's a linear progression. In culture, Boulez does not replace Bach. You're widening the repertoire of mankind. So these are different realms in this way. And therefore different principles, and moral principles underlying them. I'm a socialist in economics, because I believe that any society, to be viable, has to have a sense of participation by people, but for them to participate, they have to have the resources and the self-esteem. Otherwise, they feel humiliated, or they'll run away. So it seems to me the first obligation of a society is to provide that degree of resources, to provide people with a sense where they can participate and feel members of a society. Therefore, to that extent, I think of myself as a socialist in economics. I'm a liberal in politics because I believe in achievement and merit. Affirmative action is sometimes a principle you have to bend in order to include people in society, but still, in principle, I believe in merit. I'm Jewish. Before World War II, there was not one, 2 or 3 Jews in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Harvard. Yale, you had nobody there. The degree of anti-Semitism was rife. After World War II, this broke wide open. So I believe in achievement based upon merit. It can be, in effect, as Nick Lehman points out, can be twisted in different ways, but I believe in what I call a just meritocracy in that respect. In culture, I believe in tradition. I believe in the strength of tradition. I believe in judgment. I don't believe anything goes. I don't believe in what they call Schmierkunst, when anything is sort of is on the wall. I believe that that art itself is a history of dialogue in the past, that many great artists are trying to do something in relation to a past, and it has to have a sense of intentions to what he's doing. So in culture, in that respect, I'm a conservative. In the ordinary run-of-the-mill politics, I'm, I suppose, a social democrat, a liberal social democrat. My oldest colleague and friend Irving Kristol and I began a magazine, The Public Interest, but when we divided politically, I left simply because I said to Irving, I believe friendship is more important than ideology. I'd rather not continue fighting. So I left the magazine. I still retain friendship with him and respect him, even though we differ politically. But I think of myself as a liberal socialist, left-of-center Democrat. But that, again, is only in terms of the immediate politics. I still want to think in terms of the larger entities, that there are different principles for different kinds of societies, different realms of society. Therefore, I'd say I'm a socialist in economics, a liberal in politics, and a conservative in culture.
As a great thought thinker...
Oh, please don't. Come on.
Surely you acknowledge that these thoughts that you're talking about are large ones, and they are descriptive of this human existence. And I wonder, is if you do that, and as you publish these works, do you have any goal in what you're trying to get mankind to do, or men and women to do?
No.
Then what motivates all of this?
Thinking, curiosity, reading books by men I admire, and trying to do something which may approximate some of those things.
And what do you hope is the reaction of the rest of the world to your work?
Inevitably, I'm not interested in the rest of the world. I'm interested in the judgment of my peers. I'm interested in the judgment of those I respect. And if I win their respect, that's fine for me. There used to be a great Jewish scholar, Gershon Scholem, a master at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. great master of Jewish Kabbalah and mysticism, he would always have the notion, the man who knows. There's always one man who knows. That's a great tradition in Jewish Hebraic thought. The great Talmudic scholar. Everyone can say that's a great book, etc. You don't care. But the one man who knows, if he says yes, then you know it's made, you see. So to win the respect of someone like a Gershon Scholem or an Isaiah Berlin and such, that's what counts.
How do you rate your own work?
B plus. On that scale.
As a teacher, what do you expect? What would a student need to do in your class to get an A?
Think.
How is
Read.
that manifested? How do you know that a student is thinking or reading?
By what he writes, by what he says.
Would you accept a videotape as a report for a grade?
It's not the format that counts. Video is simply a format. It's what the content is what goes on. The crucial point is how he answers questions. I've had quite a few graduate students at Harvard. I've turned out perhaps 15 or more PhD students, and there's an entire different range among them. Paul Starr, who now runs the American Prospect, or Theda Scotch-Pole, who deals with problems of large-scale societies. Michael Schutzen, who's writing about the press. I don't have a school of thought. The only thing I can promise the students is that I will read you hard, and I will write questions in the margin and challenge you. I'm not asking you to come to my ideas. I'm not interested in propagating ideas. I want to read you hard. And since many of my colleagues have schools of thought and try to, in effect, develop it, as good scientists do, have a framework of analysis, they want students to take subsets of it and move ahead with it, fine. I don't have that. So you want to read hard and answer hard.
You talk a lot about technology, and it changes a lot. Do you think that human nature ever changes?
Well, again, it's a difficult problem. It's not human nature per se. I've said many times that man is homo duplex.
Meaning?
There's a capacity for good and capacity for evil. And the circumstances allow the expression of one or the other or encourage one or the other. There is no single nature per se. People are able to develop. They're able to, in a sense, move beyond what they began with. But basically, there's the impulses to do good and the impulses to essentially dominate others. The impulse to dominate, they're very extraordinary. And sometimes can be the source of the worst things in human existence. It goes back, and since you have a large time here, I don't know how much we've taken already, but still.
We've got a bit more time.
Well, let me take what for me has been I mentioned before Tocqueville and Marx, master keys. For me, one of the basic sources of understanding what people think of as human nature is a long section in Hegel in the Phenomenology, one of his very early books. And in the Phenomenology, he has a section which says, the very first encounter between two human beings, the encounter, is a duel to the death. You say, this is strange. Why should two human beings, in their first encounter, have a duel to the death? If they're good Christians, why don't they love one another? Or if they're good, rational human beings, in the sense of Locke, exchange goods and increase their wealth? Why a duel to the death? Now, Hegel's no fool, so to speak. The important thing is a student has to realize sometimes, one of the things I say to any student, the man you're reading is sometimes smarter than you are. Hegel's no fool, so why a duel to the death? Well, as Hegel points out, man becomes a self-infinitizing creature. He'd read Faust, and Faust says, if I cannot have godlike knowledge, I have to confess my kinship to the worm. So there's the ambition to reach godlike knowledge, to be omniscient in this respect. And he says, there's this self-infinitizing element in human nature, human beings, where there's one thing every human being in every culture knows, that one word, death, tot. And that's going to break it. And every human being knows that's going to be the case. Now, in that case, death is very difficult to live with. Religion is a compensation for that, of an afterlife. Or most people, particularly children, when they first learn about death, think, it'll never happen to me. When they turn on, the world doesn't exist. There are various fantasies which are defenses against death. Most offenses are fantasies of that. But they have one problem, you see. what happens when, if you have this fantasy of omniscience, what happens when one omniscience meets another? Two omnisciences cannot occupy the same psychic space at the same time. So there's the duel to the death, to overcome and to dominate. So the desire to dominate, the desire to overcome, which in Hegel says the Oriental despot, the first man who becomes despotic over all, a Hitler or a Stalin, is this incredible drive for omniscience. And that's, after all, the great impulse of this sort. And Hegel has this extraordinary thing. The section's called Herr und Knecht, Lord and Bondsman. Who becomes a bondsman has to, you either accept death or you bend the knee. And you therefore become the slave or the Knecht, servant of the Herr, the Lord. So Lord and Bondsman seems to be the great paradigmatic illustration of what people call by human nature. The self-infinitizing, fear of death, omniscience, and yet the readiness sometimes to stand back and say, wait a minute, perhaps we can accept the world as it is and try to be more calm about it.
Well, that goes to the heart of my question. Do you believe that man has reached that point and that the future will be different than the past in terms of human nature responding to the changes you've been describing?
No, I don't think so. Again, I go back to each book. Certain books have, great imprints in our mind. The other book is Thucydides, and the section on the Corsairian Revolution, where he points out that these things will occur and recur again so long as certain things happen. No, there are two things happening in this world which are rather unique now for the end of the 20th century. One is the expansion of scale, which makes more likely the outbreak of various things of this kind. Wars. Not just wars in a large-scale sense. Against Francis Fukuyama, some of his work I think is very good and I respect, but I don't believe in the end of history. In fact, I've written an essay called The Resumption of History, resumption of the ethnic and tribal conflicts, because communism was a blanket which suppressed some of these things, has now come back. But at the same time, there's still a sense in which the dignity of human beings, respect for life, also comes forward. And for the first time, we now have a concept which is fairly unique, weak but unique, human rights. The notion is that we can now try criminals and brand them as war criminals on the basis of violation of human rights. It's a thin reed, but it's also now a new one, along with the older religious doctrines. But human rights is a secular conception, and therefore more acceptable to a lot more people beside the older religious conceptions. So we have scale, which is going to increase conflicts between people, and human rights can try, in a sense, to put up a stand of judgment and say, no, you cannot do this. And those are the two things, I think, which are the elements we face now in the 21st century.
We do have time left, but not a lot of time, so let me get to a number of other larger questions. One is about, in your books, you talk about how man is increasingly disconnected from nature. What do you mean by that, and is there going to be a progression further and further away from nature, and what are the consequences of that?
Well, the disconnection comes first from the fact that most human beings over the millennium, character is shaped by work. The kind of person you are is shaped by work. Most of the work has been against what I call a game against nature. People who work on the soil, in the forests, in the mines, on the sea. So those, in a sense, most people who work until even today are basically in terms of are shaped by the forces of nature and the vicissitudes of nature. Then with the Industrial Revolution, you have what I call work against fabricated nature, which is in relation to machines. So the industrial society is basically a game against fabricated nature, and today you have what I call a game between persons, where more and more people involved with one another. They're working in groups, research teams, small groups, internet relationships, and therefore the character of work is no longer shaped by nature, no longer even shaped by machines, but shaped more by intellectual pursuits of the various kinds, at least large portions of work.
That sounds like a good thing.
Good or bad, because also the kind of work. If the work is challenging enough and force you to deal with problem solutions rather than having them ready-made, okay, because there's always a pressure, particularly in the nature of all economics, to make solutions ready-made, because if they're ready-made, they're cheaper, and they can be reproduced, and therefore, if they're reproducible, they become more technological. And that's the nature of technology. Technology is reproducible things. So the disconnection from nature is mostly in terms of relation to work. And nature becomes therefore more of a hobby, or hiking, or farming, or simply of gardening, or what have you, in the simplest sense of the term.
The premise of the question, I guess, is that man's connection with nature is essential. For some good, do you believe that?
I don't know I'm not sure about essential. In the past, it's certainly been the case because the character's been shaped by the kind of work you do. And therefore, as I say, people with seamen or farmers or timbermen, etc. But I'm not thinking essentially that being disconnected from that kind of nature is necessarily wrong because a lot of the work was brutal. People forget how brutal they were. There's a marvelous book by a man named Ronald Blythe called Aikenfield, talking about the people who worked in England as agricultural laborers. And the thing that struck him most is the number of people who lost thumbs or parts of fingers and such, working against the plows and other such things, and worked from 12, 14 hours a day. So working with nature is not necessarily ennobling. It can be very brutal as well. In both cases, it can be challenging, beautiful, or brutal. Same thing with a lot of even intellectual work.
Back to political systems. Do you think democracy is necessarily the ultimate political system?
No.
What is?
Liberty.
What is the political system that allows liberty to survive or to flourish?
A system which understands rights and protects rights. Democracy can also have tyrannies of their own. Tocqueville pointed out the tyranny of the majority. As Churchill used to say, it's the least worst system per se. But I'm not a Democrat first. I believe in liberty first, which is protection against arbitrary intrusions of various kinds, and protections of rights, and bringing people into a society, where I said I'm a social economics on that level. So I think the important point is, as Isaiah Berlin said, both there's negative liberty and positive liberty. Perhaps the most important thing is negative liberty, which is the protections of certain rights that one has, and the maintenance of those rights.
But wouldn't a political system need to have its leaders chosen?
Oh, yes.
And then how would that be done and still achieve liberty?
Well, democracy is who rules, liberty is how you rule. And you need both.
Do you foresee, again with the predictions, benevolent despots?
In this country, no. There used to be a fear. Sinclair Lewis wrote a book called It Can't Happen Here, which he thought fascism might come. Harold Lasky, in his book on the American presidency, thought fascism might come here. I've told this story a number of times. If I have a few minutes, I can tell it again. When I began the commission on the year 2000, in 1964, I went to John Gardner, who was then the head of the Carnegie Corporation, and I'd written a memorandum, and John said, well, it's very interesting, but give me a prediction, as you asked earlier. I said, John's very hard to predict. He said, if you can't give me one prediction, you don't get the money. Well, to paraphrase Dr. Johnson, there's nothing like the loss of money to concentrate the mind. And quite spontaneously, I said, well, look, Trump, this is 1964. There'll be an election for president of the United States in November 64, 1968, 72, 76. You mean every 4 years we'll be elected for president of the United States? I said, yes. He said, that's a damn trivial prediction. I said, John, you're right, but tell me, there are now about 120 countries in the world. About how many countries can you make that prediction? And
you talked, too, about the scarcity of time, and the scarcities in the future are not what we've had in the past. How can there be a scarcity of time?
Because there are more things we have to do.
Why? We're still the same human beings.
Because there are many more tasks we have to do. Many more things open to us. You now have television, internet, radio, newspapers. I mean, the multiplicity of things we have to do, the amount of things available to us. And we have to choose. I said this odd combination of things. We now become homo economicus now in leisure, because we have to choose and make allocations in the area of leisure where we used to make it work. So the very multiplication, the very fact that you have more democracy. People say, let's have more democratic decision-making. Well, you have to have more committees, more people serving on committees, more record-keeping with the committees. So that, again, is going to be more scarce in this way.
What do you mean by capitalism without capitalists?
Oh, that capitalism is basically a system of relationships of property and property rights, and you can simply have that form without ownership in the personal sense. The old capitalism was a system of ownership by capitalists in this respect, but you can simply have a system of relationships of property. You have social units being, but it's basically more to a market system. It's using a market system in order to deal with the efficiency of economic relationships of that kind, and therefore you don't need capitalists to do that per se necessarily.
We should also mention another book that was rather well regarded that you wrote called The Cultural Contradictions of Capitalism. We're showing the 20th anniversary edition. What is the basic idea behind that book? When did it come out?
It came out about 2 years after the Post-Industrial Society book, and then reprinted 2 years ago with another long. The basic idea of the cultural contradictions is that you began with a society of delayed gratification, dedication to work, Protestant ethic, and you become a hedonistic society. So there's a split between production and consumption, so to speak. So that the whole question of how you manage a society where in the areas of work, you want people to work hard, to obey the rules and such, and yet the other areas of life become totally hedonistic. In fact, more and more capitalism depends upon the promotion of consumption of this kind. So that there's basically, to that extent, a break away from what Max Weber called the old Protestant ethic. People still talk about the work ethic and the Protestant ethic, and yet, on the other hand, you have a situation of great hedonism. I had an illustration in there many years ago. American Airlines had something called Take the Bob and Carol, Ted and Alice, Phil and Ann vacation. It says, fly now, pay later. It was an invitation to wife swapping by going down to the Caribbean. So you say, fly now, pay later. They didn't say what you pay later. But there it was, and you say, this is weird. Here's an American Airlines taking a phrase in the Bob and Carol, Phil and Ann, and Ted and Alice vacation. Well, this is, to me, a cultural contradiction of capitalism.
Given the fact, you've said, I think I heard you say that human nature really doesn't change that much. Is that did I reach the right conclusion?
The human nature being the two dimensions, so to speak, of what I call homo duplex.
Then, in that case, as society changes in the future, will the same kind of person who's successful in the industrial society be successful, and I guess the definition of successful is relevant here, but nevertheless thrive in a post-industrial society?
Not necessarily, because the prototypical person of success is the engineer of an industrial society, plus a capitalist and to some extent an entrepreneur. But the main success of a post-industrial society is basically intellectual property, intellectual capital, because it's an intellectual technology. The marketing of it is often the same, but the innovation procedures are very different in that regard. So the marketing is the same because you're dealing with mass marketing, but the innovations have a very different form in that regard too.
Taking it all in, are you an optimist about the future?
Well, you forced me back to one of my oldest stories, since I grew up in it's a story about a man at the day of creation, an old rabbi standing at the edge of heaven at the day of creation. And the angels were celebrating the handiwork of the Lord, and one of the angels danced up to him and said, Rabbi, isn't this marvelous what God has done? Are you optimistic or pessimistic? Look at the bounty down below. And the rabbi looked at the smiling face of the angel and said, I'm optimistic. They looked down the world. And the answer, tell me, Rabbi, if you're optimistic, why are you scowling so? To tell you the truth, I don't think my optimism is justified.
I don't know what to conclude from that, except that we're out of time. Daniel Bell, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Daniel Bell is a professor emeritus at Harvard University and scholar in residence at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He is the author of 17 books, including The End of Ideology and The Cultural Contradictions of Capitalism. Both books were cited by the Times Literary Supplement as among the 100 most influential books since World War II. Mr. Bell was an editor at Fortune magazine and a co-founder of The Public Interest. His book, The Coming of Post-Industrial Society, was originally published in 1973, and it's still in print, published by Basic Books.